different committees: Engineering Institute of Canada, American Institute of Medical Biological Engineering, and I'll let you to enjoy his talk on system identification. And no, you're not talking about system identification today.
Well, that's mostly what I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
We'll see.
Okay, thank you. Please join me to welcome Dr. Kearney.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Sarah for the invitation. It's interesting to come from one cold city to another. It's not clear which was colder this morning, Winnipeg or Montreal. So to start with, if I do not speak loud enough, I could claim that I mumble at times. I don't believe that to be true, but sometimes it happens. Let me know and I'll try to speak up. And secondly, if in the middle of my talk I've got you lost or you don't understand something, please don't hesitate to ask questions, and I'll try my best to clarify things. So, what are we talking about? Well, we're going to talk about today two things. We're going to talk about trying to understand what the mechanical behavior of joints is, how that influences the control of posture and movement, and because of that, we're interested in also methods which allow us to study that. So when we say dynamic joint stiffness, what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that if you take a joint, an elbow, an ankle, and move it back and forth, you'll find a mechanical resistance. And the dynamic relationship between the position of the joint and the torque about it is what I choose to refer to as dynamic stiffness. There is a group from MIT who feel this should be called impedance. Essentially, we're talking about the same thing, and we won't go into the details of why, because it becomes a philosophical question. But basically, we're talking about regarding mechanical behavior of a joint in the same way as you might regard measuring the impedance of an electrical circuit or an instrument. Now, this defines the mechanical behavior of a joint. And in principle, it means that if you know what the dynamic stiffness is, you can predict what torque will be generated as a result of the position change. It comes from three basic mechanisms. First, it's just the passive stiffness of the joint as a result of the connective tissue, the tendons, and viscoelastic behavior of the joint. So if I'm an orthopedic surgeon, when I talk about stiffness, to measure stiffness, the first thing I do is I take the joint and I rip out all this nasty muscle stuff that does it. But in actual fact, as we know, when you're functioning, the other thing that contributes to the behavior is the properties of active muscle stiffness. So muscle is an interesting device in that as it generates force, it not only generates force, but its mechanical behavior changes. So in fact, muscle is a force-generating device whose stiffness increases as you generate force. This is opposed to most engineering devices where the stiffness is independent of the force that's generated. And the third component is reflex stiffness. And by this I mean that the periphery of the neuromuscular system is equipped with sensitive proprioceptors to pick up muscle force, velocity, acceleration, and position. And this gets fed back to change the muscle level of activity. And so when one moves the joint back and forth, there's basically three things contributing to it: the passive, the intrinsic, and the reflex stiffness. And it's a reasonable question to ask, what are the relative contributions of these three? And how does the nervous system handle these, and what happens with disease? And so the sorts of questions about why is it important is that if I'm standing or walking and I have a sudden perturbation, it's the mechanical stiffness which determines the change that results from this perturbation. It also, turning it around, means that if I want to generate a movement, the stiffness determines how much force I need to generate for this movement. So So those of you who have ever designed a control system knows that it's important to know what the plant is. And in terms of the motor system, the dynamic stiffness is the plant that we're talking about. And it also provides an objective, quantitative measure of joint mechanics. If I go to my neurologist and complain that I have a stiff joint, he's going to move my limb back and forth and say possibly you're normal, you're hypertonic, you've got more resistance, or hypotonic, less resistance, and if it's really bad, he'll say it's plus plus or plus minus. Basically, he's working with about 5 different levels. He's working with a 2-bit A to D converter. Since A to D converters basically have 1 bit of noise, what you're looking at is they can tell hyper and hypo from normal, but it's not a very sensitive measure. And as we'll see later, it has some other issues. So why do we want to study it? Well, first of all, from a basic viewpoint, as I pointed out, this is our plant, this is what controls it. So basically, we're interested in understanding what it is so we can understand what the brain does. In the bad old days, I went to motor control meetings, and there were 2 types of people. People who were interested below the spinal cord. So their experimental setups basically consisted of taking a cat and cutting off everything above the spinal cord and only measuring the periphery. And the central guys who basically thought we could figure out everything just by the recording from central motor neurons, central neurons. We now know you need to be able to look at, first of all, what's going on in the center, what's going on in the periphery, and how they connect and feed back. And therefore, that's important. It's also important as providing a way of diagnosing neuromuscular pathology. People who had spinal cord injuries can suffer from stiffness, which may be rigidity, and it may be as a result of hyperactive reflexes. That gets treated either by using anesthetic to basically anesthetize the feedback, or in the worst case, going in and cutting the spinal roots. However, it may also be due to mechanical changes. If you immobilize a joint for a while, you get contractures. So it's important to be able to distinguish whether what you're seeing is a result of reflex activities or changes in intrinsic. And what's becoming more important now is in terms of the design and control of rehabilitation devices. So there's increasing interest in rehab robots, which can help deliver rehabilitation therapy to people falling neuromuscular diseases. Powered prostheses, in other words, especially as a result of the involvement in the wars in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, where they're basically, as a result of the improvement of body armor, more people are starting to survive devastating injuries without limbs. And so there's been great interest in the States in building these things. And powered orthoses, the difference being for prostheses, what you're doing is you're replacing a lost limb. With an orthosis, what you're doing is you're essentially trying to apply external force to help a paralyzed limb. And also the issue of functional electrical stimulation, where here the idea is what you do is you use electrical stimulation to basically make use of muscle which exists in people who've lost central nervous control as a result of spinal cord. Can you electrically stimulate this? And in all 3 of these situations, I've put to you the hypothesis that the technology we now have for building devices is good and for stimulating. What lacks is a sensible way of controlling these devices. And the hypothesis that we've just been funded to investigate is that what you should do is you should build these powered devices in order to replicate the mechanical behavior of the normal limb. But before you can do that, you need to know what that mechanical behavior is. So what sort of questions do we have? First of all, how do we describe it? What sort of model do we need to describe it? How do the different mechanisms contribute? Do reflexes do anything? How does it change during function? If I tell you, stand here and hold my arm out, I'll do one thing. If I say, stand here and hold the arm out with a full cup of coffee and don't spill it, I'll do something else. And you all will probably realize that if you're up tense, you will tense up and try to do things. These are all ways that the nervous system is changing its peripheral mechanical behavior. How does the CNS control? What can the CNS control? And what happens with disease? And are we looking at changes which are as a result of the disease, or are they compensations for disease? Now, the guiding principle of the work I'm going to talk about is that quantitative dynamic knowledge of joint stiffness and the relative contributions of different mechanisms to it are essential to understand and control the posture of movement. And secondly, that a system identification approach is the way to deal with this. So what is system identification? Well, system identification is the poor brother of modeling. It's a modeling technique, but a technique in which, rather than trying to look at what we know about the system and build models, what we do is we do experiments and look at the relationship between manipulating the input of the system, observing the results, and trying to build the model. I have great respect for my colleagues who take the top-down approach, where they take basically an understanding of the structure of a system and try to build parametric models. But, for example, in the case of the neuromuscular system, it's very easy to build extremely complicated models, most of whose parameters you can't estimate. And so for our approach has been one to say, let's try to build models that describe the behavior, and then use those models to deduce what we can about what goes on. So what's wanted? Well, ideally, we want a quantitative model for stiffness, right, which gives us what's going on in terms of intrinsic and reflex mechanisms, that works for rapid, large movements. If we've ever watched a hockey game, watch the Jets. I guess you're watching them more often now than you have earlier. But basically what you can see there is that what you're looking at is functional movements involve large, very rapid, very forceful movements. And the other thing that is involved is they have compliant loads. When I make a move, I have a load which is compliant. And as a result of that, if I measure position and torque, the position and torque are connected by feedback. And that causes problems for identification. That's what we want. That's not what we have. What I want to talk about for the rest of the time is some work that we've done to try to move towards that direction. What's our approach? Well, it's an incremental approach. We're going to start simple and work our way up. So the experimental setup that we've worked in for a long time is to look at a single joint, the ankle joint. The ankle is interesting from a functional viewpoint because in most cases that's how we interact with our environment. When we're walking, standing, whatnot, the only way we can actually exert forces on our environment is to generate forces around the ankle. From a selfish experimental viewpoint, it also has the advantage of being relatively low inertia and relatively simple biomechanically. The ankle basically can be thought of as having 2 degrees of freedom. If I were interested in the shoulder, for example, as some of my colleagues are, you're left with 17 degrees of freedom. Right? So that, for a Ph.D. student, is either a challenge or if it's a sensible Ph.D. student, or perhaps more likely a sensible supervisor, it's something to stay with. So our experiments, to start with, are very simple. Lie the subject down, attach the subject to an electrohydraulic actuator, which is faster and stronger than the subject, and then basically do an experiment that simply shows the actual mechanical implementation. One of the things are when you have a fast actuator, you need to make sure that where the actuator goes, the subject's foot goes. So we build a custom fitted fiberglass cast to each subject's foot, and they're very careful to align its axis of rotation with the axis of rotation of the ankle. So if we do a simple experiment where we apply position changes, we which are pseudo-random perturbations, just going back and forth, and record the torque and the EMG, we can see two things. First of all, there's a reflex response each time we dorsiflex the ankle. Every time we stretch the calf muscles, there's a reflex response. And if you're a true believer, you can see here activity which looks like a muscle twitch. And it happens only when we dorsiflex. It doesn't happen when we plantarflex. And therefore suggests we have a reflex activity. So we developed a few years ago, a number of years ago, a parallel cascade model which allows us to take this data and work out what we think are the intrinsic and the reflex contributions to the torque. We model the intrinsic pathway as linear dynamic. The reflex pathway is a Hammerstein system. And this is a system which only responds, basically a Hammerstein system is a system which is static nonlinearity followed by linear dynamics. And then separate the intrinsic and reflex contributions iteratively. And the particular model we use for linear dynamics is an impulse response function. And basically the impulse response function allows you to predict the response to an arbitrary input by using the convolution. And then the methods we use to estimate both the nonlinearity and the linear dynamics are sort of classic correlation-based methods. This is sort of an overview of the model, where what we do is we start with the position. The first thing we estimate are linear dynamics here. And what we do is we take advantage of the fact that we know the reflex pathway has a delay of 40 milliseconds. So by keeping the length of this impulse response to be less than 40 milliseconds, the only thing that can contribute there are the linear dynamics. This allows us to make a prediction of the intrinsic torque. We can subtract that from a recorded torque, come up with an estimate of what the reflex torque is, and then estimate this pathway, which consists of a static nonlinearity followed by linear dynamics. In fact, what we originally did is we cheated. We said we knew what the static nonlinearity was, and then estimated these dynamics. And then as you basically iterate back and forth, once we have an estimate of the reflex torque, we can use that to come up with a better estimate of the intrinsic torque, and after 4 or 5 iterations, we can come up with a good estimate of what goes on. So when we do that, we can predict the torque due to the intrinsic mechanisms, we can predict the torque due to the reflex mechanisms, and we can combine them to get a very good estimate of the total torque that we observe. Here what we're doing is we're superimposing the estimated to the observed. Now, one of the problems we have is the impulse response formulation is nice because it makes no a priori assumptions about what the structure is. The trouble is if we want to relate that back to a smaller number of parameters of physiological meaning, it becomes more difficult. So what we did here is we basically found that we could fit the compliance impulse response. That's actually the inverse of the intrinsic stiffness. We do that because it's easier to fit it that way. And we're able to fit that with a model which basically has 3 parameters which make sense. An inertia, a viscosity, and an elastic parameter. And fortunately, when we do that, the inertia parameter that comes out turns out to be about what we expect it to be based on the net. And so that basically gives us a nice way of summarizing what happens. Reflex dynamics are a little more complicated. They come out with a delay, and again, they can be modeled as either a second-order low-pass filter or a third-order low-pass filter, and which looks suspiciously like a muscle twitch. And so the interpretation we have is that what we're looking at is velocity-sensitive pathway, which has a static nonlinearity associated with it, and dynamics which we think would make sense with regard to the way a muscle would contract. Now, that's fine, except when we change the operating point, so if we move the joint through its range of motion, or we have the subject generate different levels of torque, what we find is the models change. Actually, they change in a very consistent fashion. So as we change the position of the joint, and as we go basically from a plantar flex to a dorsiflex position, what we find is that there's a consistent increase in intrinsic reflex gain and a big change in the reflex stiffness gain. So what we can see is that, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. This is for the ankle joint.
Yes, ma'am.
Right? How many degrees of freedom did you assume for?
So the ankle joint, we're only looking at plantar flex and dorsiflex. Sure, I should have made that clear. There is another degree of freedom, inversion and eversion, which we didn't look at. And in fact, one of the advantages of looking at the ankle is that you can actually individually stimulate. Neville Hogan's got some papers that are just coming out where he started to look at the multi-degree of freedom issues there.
So I wonder if you increase the number of freedom in the joint movement, then would the change of operating point still changes the stiffness?
We have not done those experiments, but I'll buy you lunch if it doesn't. Yeah. Certainly the position changes and the, I think what you're looking at is essentially, if you look at most functional activity takes place in dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and the inversion, eversion movements are relatively small. They're not particularly important when we're walking on a level ground. They become important when you do what they call cross walking. You walk on where you have different hills going on. And I'm also told that it's important if you're driving a tank. So colleagues in Israel have looked at eversion and inversion. The message here, though, is there's this consistent change in both the intrinsic properties and the reflex properties as a function of position, where basically as you stretch the muscle, reflex gain increases. And similarly, when we look at the effect of the amount of torque that you generate, there's a consistent, nice linear relationship between the intrinsic stiffness, but the reflex stiffness is a little more complicated. The interesting thing here is that what you find is that reflex gain is maximum when you just slightly activate a muscle, and then it actually decreases. And this is actually a situation where you get slightly different results when you're actually making mechanical measurements as opposed to measurements that you're making electric. What happens is that with measuring EMG activity, the activation of the muscle, that doesn't behave quite the same way. And the hypothesis we have is this is because there's another thing coming in, is that you're basically ending up with some synchronization effects which make the EMG look unnaturally large. When we talked to our neurologist friends, they said, oh yeah, that's right. What they said is, if I have someone I can't find a reflex in, I said, just make a slight contribution, and bingo, the reflex will pop up. But what this sort of tells us here is that if we're asking a question, what do the reflexes do? What do intrinsic mechanisms do? We can't answer that question simply by saying yes or no. We have to say, what operating point are we at? In one area, it's quite clear, probably nothing. Right? In another area, probably a lot. This may, in fact, have something to do with the fact that when we stand, we tend to stand with our center of gravity in front of the axis of rotation, so that the muscles here are active, the gastrocnemius and soleus, our calf muscle. And that also we have a much larger, essentially, range of freedom of movement before we become disabled than when we go backwards. Basically, when we go backwards, it's much less stable. we then say, what are the relative contributions? What we see is that basically in terms of the relative contribution that the reflexes make, basically maximize for small values of activation and maximize around the neutral position. So they make the largest relative contribution, even though it's not the largest absolute contribution. And that's because the intrinsic mechanisms are going up more quickly. Now, if we look at spinal cord injured patients and do the same experiment and compare reflex stiffness, what we see with these guys is basically what happens is you see the change that we saw previously in the control studies becomes small, and we get this enormously increased reflex contribution in spinal cord injury studies. In fact, almost 50, basically it becomes almost the dominant component. So in the literature, there's a question of, does the increased reflex activity associated with spasticity actually have a mechanical effect? And what you can see here is it clearly does. You show the similar plot for intrinsic reflexes, what you'll find is that there's no difference. The problem is when we try to correlate our measures of stiffness, our nice engineering measures of stiffness, with clinical measures, such as the Ashworth scale or the Kubel-Meyer scale, there's almost no correlation between them. So the problem that we have is we're making a measurement which clearly distinguishes between the normal and this doesn't seem to correlate with clinical measures. One explanation for that, of course, is that clinical measures are no good. The other possibility is that they're measuring something else. And remember, our measurements are made basically making small perturbations around an operating point, whereas what clinicians will do is when they do this, they will perform a variety of tasks. In fact, when you talk to them more carefully, they'll tell you that if I'm looking at a Parkinson patient, I'll move the limb at one rate. If I think it's someone spastic, it'll be a different rate. And so really what the problem is that what we're looking at in clinical measures is not simply the mechanical behavior of the patient. We're looking at the interaction of the mechanical behavior of the patient with the mechanical behavior of the clinician and some sort of subjective judgment. And so part of the issue is we don't really understand what's going on there. And probably what it means is we're not looking at the same thing they're looking at. The final thing to talk about is the fact for a long time there's been a question of, can we actually independently control reflex stiffness and intrinsic stiffness? And one of the problems we have is that it's been known for a long while that if you increase the voluntary contraction, intrinsic stiffness will increase reflex stiffness. Now what Daniel Ludwig did as a Ph.D. student is he took our algorithm, parallel cascade algorithm, and implemented it as a real-time situation so that we could actually feed back to the patient, or student, reflex and intrinsic stiffness, and then display this on a screen and ask the subject, so can we move around this path? When we do this, what he showed was if we plot the reflex gain along one axis and the elastic stiffness along another axis and the torque that he was generated on the longer axis, what you can see, this patient, the subject was able to generate a wide range of reflex gains at the same elastic stiffness. And so what this tells us basically is not only are these big changes associated with reflex and intrinsic stiffness built in as a result of position and operating point, but on top of it, you have the ability to voluntarily change this. Okay. What we're able to demonstrate is that people can learn to do this. Once they learn to do it, they remember how to do it, and they can voluntarily manipulate it up and down a little differently. What we haven't yet demonstrated is that people actually do this when they learn to perform tasks. This has been part of the motor control literature for a while, that people use the ability to change the reflex up and down, but no one's actually demonstrated this. Now, where are we? Well, this parallel cascade method yields quasi-stationary. So basically, it gives us a model of a particular operating point. It separates the intrinsic, but it only works for stiff loads. In other words, in these experiments, what we do is we use the actuator to drive the joint to where it goes and look at the responses. And it only works for a fixed operating point. Now, there are limitations to this. First of all, our nonlinear model depends on the operating point. And in functional activities, these operating points change. Secondly, the correlation-based methods are going to run into trouble with compliant modes because you'll be identifying a closed loop. Third, they're over-parameterized. Right? The impulse response, each impulse response has a large number of parameters. And what that means is that in noisy situations, you're going to have trouble coming up with good estimates. And finally, it's an iterative method, iterating back and forth between the intrinsic and the reflex. And there's no guarantee it will converge. In fact, we now know that it doesn't converge under some conditions. To sort of emphasize this issue, we have another set of experiments where we have a subject standing on two of these actuators. And we're able to independently perturb left and right leg. And when we do this experiment, what we do is we have the subject standing, and we apply perturbations at random times. What you can see here are the reflex responses. But what you can see is that the mean torque is varied. It turns out that when you stand, you never stand perfectly still. You're oscillating back and forth. So if we look at the amplitude of these responses, and this simply shows a blown-up example of the response, where the early component is intrinsic and the late component is reflex. And Chris Lang has analyzed these to sort of measure the amplitude of these responses. And what you find is that basically intrinsic is not constant. So as you're standing, this is the torque that's reported in terms of essentially where your center of pressure is, and this is the amplitude of the reflex response. And what you can see is, first of all, it varies consistently as you sway back and forth. And secondly, there's a lot of variability even at one position. And what that tells us two things is that we can't simply look at stance using our quasi-stationary methods. We need some method which is going to allow us to do estimation in this situation. Similarly, we find that the reflex stiffness is modulated. Another experiment happens is we take a simple case where we take an ankle and drive the ankle through a trajectory similar to what we see during walking and apply perturbations. What we can see is that as we apply these perturbations at different parts of the walking cycle, that the amplitude of the response changes dramatically. In fact, if we look at this, what the walking red curves show us is the amplitude of the response according to the phase of the locomotion. And what the green tells us is the amplitude of the response that we get in the equivalent position without the ramping. So it tells us two things. We can't predict what's going to happen during movement from what we observe during stationary conditions. And therefore, there's a requirement to actually study the dynamics of these things during walking. This simply shows you that what happens is that when we make this load compliant, that is small, then what happens is this noise we measure in the torque curve gets fed back to the input. And so we have input and output connected by feedback, and from basically an estimation viewpoint, it runs us into trouble. Anytime you're doing a regression study, you always assume there's no noise on the input. If there's noise on the input, you're in trouble. And that's basically what the closed loop identification application at all. So to start solving these problems, we thought we needed new methods. And the first step in this direction was to go to essentially some state-space methods. And in the state-space methods, what we essentially do is take this single input, single output, nonlinear reflex model. So we take position, here's our intrinsic pathway, here's our reflex pathway, and we convert this into a multiple input, single output, linear model. So the first thing we do is we just differentiate our position 3 times. So we get 3 pathways, proportionate position, velocity, and acceleration. And then what we do is we take our reflex stiffness and express this as an orthogonal expansion. So rather than having a single static nonlinearity, what we do is we take our input and expand it with a series of orthogonal polynomials, so that what we have is essentially a set of pathways which are orthogonal. For example, in a simple way, one might imagine this would be the 0 order, the first order, the second order, the third order monomial. In fact, we use orthogonal polynomials to make these. Now, the point, what you can see here, is essentially what we now have by transforming our input from a single input to this multiple input, is we now have a linear model, which can be expressed as a standard state-space model, where the derivative of the state is equal to the A matrix times X plus B, Y is equal to C, and their output is given by this. Now, remember, these are now vectors and matrices rather than not. So our input is now this constructed input consisting of the position, velocity, and acceleration, and then the orthogonal expansions. And we'll go from there. Now, what Yang Zhao did is he basically did this formulation and demonstrated that we could actually estimate the parameters well using a state-space method called the subspace method. And this has the advantage of this subspace method actually determines the order of the model of each pathway. It can be used in closed loop, and it has multiple input, multiple output support built in. And he showed with this work that he could, in fact, describe the input-out behavior very well. He had a model that worked very well. The difficulty was, with his formulation, it was over-parameterized, which made it very difficult to go from his model to an understanding of what the individual parameters are. Kearney took Yang's method, reformulated in such a way as to reduce the number of parameters, and essentially relate the parameters of this model to our original situation, and then estimate the initial conditions. And by the way, he also used convex optimization theory, which means he's now guaranteed to converge. So to evaluate it, he did a series of studies in which he simulated an ankle. And one of the problems that you have with simulations is, A, how do I actually understand that the behavior I'm seeing is realistic? So what he did is he basically went off and recorded a whole bunch of experimental inputs and experimental noise. And so basically he ended up doing his Monte Carlo study using real inputs and real noise signals. And what he did is that if we looked at the parallel cascade, so what you're looking at here is 1,000 trials, each with a different input and each with a different noise. The red curve is the true, and the blue curve are each individual response. Now what you can see is that on average it looks like it does a pretty good job, but there are clearly cases where it doesn't do a very good job at all. With the subspace method, what we find variance is much lower. And the secret behind this probably isn't too difficult to understand. We're going from a couple of hundred parameters to a couple of dozen parameters, which means we can reasonably expect it to be much more robust than the present. We then took this data and looked at what happens when we actually apply this to some real experimental data. And what he found was that with the subspace method, he looked at a single position with subjects either pulling up, contracting gasterosaurs, or tibialis anterior, pushing down, or relaxed. And in each case, he was able to identify both the shape of the nonlinearity and the linear dynamics. First thing that popped out is that when you contract, two things happen. Both the gain changes and the threshold moves up. So basically what we have added is now a more complete understanding of what happens. And we compare this to the parallel cascade method, we can see that in the situation in which we're plantar flexing, as we're pushing down, we end up with good results. But basically it breaks down the other conditions. So in fact, we have a method which not only theoretically is better, but is practical. Now, another advantage of this method is that basically we can estimate initial conditions, which means that rather than needing one long data segment, we can use a bunch of short segments. So P.Eng further modified this so that we can just take a bunch of chunks of data and tie them together. And showed that there's a trade-off between the number and the length of segments in order to get a good estimation. And the implication here is that he looked at this data from standing, and as you can see, basically what he was able to do is identify chunks of data where it looks like the torque was more or less constant, tie them together, and estimate dynamics from that. What he was able to show here is that basically, as you sway back and forth, you can see there is this change in the impulse response function. To terminate, we're going to say what happens when things change more quickly. We have two answers to that. One is essentially one which uses a model which is essentially based on time-varying convolution. And the key thing to look at here is, in this case, the impulse response depends not only on lag, but time, so that what we model the behavior, if we have someone making a repeatable movement, we can model the dynamics as changing at each point in time. And in fact, basically, in order to do this, we need an ensemble of responses in which we have the same time-varying behavior with different inputs. We can do this and estimate dynamics in this situation. This is a simulation study that says it works in simulation. And this is what happens when we do this closed walking experiment. And here what we can see is that there's consistent changes of the compliance impulse response and the reflex impulse response throughout. So what we're saying here is, whereas before we saw there was a response to a pulse, what we're now able to do is to model the complete change. Now, it's very nice, this ensemble method, because it can track things on a sample-by-sample basis. It has some major weaknesses. First, it's correlation-based, which means secondly, it's very over-parameters. Remember, what we now have is a separate impulse response to each sample at a time. That translates into two things. If there's noise, it gives us problems. And secondly, it's different experimental. We need to do a lot of trials to do this. And what we found is we can talk to students into doing it once, twice, 3 times, and then they disappeared. And the other problem is that it only tells us what happened for a particular trajectory. So this tells us what happens if we walk in that trajectory. It doesn't tell us what happens if we change the frequency or the amplitude of the shape. So this has led to the final thing I want to talk about, which is the proposal to use LPV, or linear parameter varying methods, to identify. What's key here is that the state space model has now been modified so that this A matrix, the B matrix, the C matrix, and the D matrix are no longer fixed, but are functions of one or more scheduling variables. And essentially the trick here is you have to identify how these matrices change as a function of the scheduling variable. In this case, the scheduling variable we chose was position and activation level, but other possibilities can extend this to essentially expand position in some sort of a orthogonal series. Basically what we're saying is we're no longer saying that these parameters are varying as a function of time. We're saying that they're varying as some function of joint position. And the advantages of this is that if it works, they allow us to capture the underlying dynamics, allows us to predict novel trajectories, and equally important, LPV control theory is reasonably well advanced. So if we have an LPV model of an ankle, it allows us to essentially build this into a control system for orthosis. So the imposed walking experiment we did, again, same sort of behavior. The first analysis we did, and basically this is work in progress, so I'm going to walk you through where we are, tell you where we hope to go. First thing we did is we simply looked at the intrinsic pathway. And what we did is we picked an input which we were pretty sure was going to kill most of the reflex. And when we did this, what we were able to do is use the LPV method to come back basically to estimate a value of the the intrinsic stiffness as a function of position for 5 microseconds. And what we can see is more or less it's what we got from the static case, in that it changes consistently as a function of position. But remember, this is all from one experiment. One experiment in which we move the joint back and forth. The next step was to start looking at the reflex. Since we hadn't worked out how to handle intrinsic, we looked at reflex EMG, which it's reasonable to assume that the linear dynamics are constant. It's a static nonlinear and it's changing. When we did this, we were able to identify essentially both the linear dynamics. And here is a picture of the static nonlinearity as a function of velocity on one hand and mean joint position on the other. I understand that's probably difficult to follow, but basically what we can do is we can essentially go through and take slices through this thing as a function of different positions. And what we can see is two things are happening as we change the position. The slope of the nonlinearity is changing, which is, it means that the gain is changing. And in addition to that, there's this, it appears to be a change in the threshold point. And essentially what this tells us is one of the questions in the spastic literature, the literature of people with spasticity is it a change of threshold or is it a change of gain which is responsible for the hyperactivity? Based on this, we would suggest that the answer to those questions would be yes, probably change both. We haven't done this on spastic subjects, but it's the next step was basically to say, well, what happens if we have both static nonlinearity and the linear dynamics changing? Basically, to look at this, we simulated a situation in which we changed both the slope and the threshold of the nonlinearity and changed the linear dynamics. And basically, we're able to show with this that the LPV approach was able to successfully identify what went on when we applied this large amplitude input as a sinusoid. So we get excellent behavior. The other nice thing is if we took this same model that we identified and applied it to a different trajectory, we got the hoped-for business to predict. So this is a model which was done with one set of trajectories, we applied it with another set of trajectories, which indicates that we're in the right direction. What are the next steps? Well, the next step is to get the whole shebang, the whole intrinsic and the reflex. He said he was doing the work and informs me that it's almost there. Any of you who are graduate students know that almost is a very flexible period of time, which typically means 3 months from today, and in 3 months it's still 3 months from today. So the summary is, my argument is that dynamic quantitative knowledge of stiffness is important to understand motor control. In order to do this, we have to consider the time-varying, nonlinear, and closed-loop neuromuscular properties, and that what I've talked to you today is some specialized methods that we're addressing in order to try to answer these difficult problems. And hopefully these methods are not only applicable to the particular problem that we're looking at, but essentially any system which can be modeled as essentially a parallel cascade of a linear system and Hammerstein system, which means, I hope, it's okay. Acknowledgements, I'd like to acknowledge formally, typically when one stands up in front of an audience to say, we've done this, what it really means is the students have done it according to the supervisor, with the supervisor's aid, and occasionally with the students feel that they've done it despite the supervisor's aid. I've been very fortunate having a bunch of very bright, very hardworking, and amiable individuals. And I've had support from CHR, NSERC, FRSQ, FQRT, which are essentially the Quebec versions of NSERC and CHR, and most recently from Qatar to do this work. So thank you for your patience, and happy to answer any questions.
Really interesting research. My question is, as far as I understood from your presentation, the identified joint stiffness is quite diverse, right? So is that meaningful if we use the stiffness identified from the experiment to establish some dynamic model and use that model to predict something?
Well, I think the answer is it varies a lot with the operating point,
right,
but it varies in a consistent fashion with the operating point. So in terms of, if I were trying to use this to, say, build an orthosis for a particular patient,
right,
we're left with two approaches. One is essentially a control program. We build a control system which we say is going to be good for a range of values. And we can do that. The trouble with that approach is typically when you build a control system which is robust under those conditions, you trade off robustness for performance. So our other approach to do is to say, if we know what the form is, and we could conceivably imagine a relatively simple experiment which would allow us to characterize the individual properties of the subject and use that either to build a particular prosthesis for that subject, or alternatively to use that to characterize the diagnostic process. So there's two things that have gone on, and maybe I haven't emphasized it as much, but one of the advantages of these new methods is they require much less data in order to come up with more complete behavior. So the LPV approach essentially allows us to do in about 2 minutes what would previously take 4 hours. Your point's well taken, but there are ways around it.
What do you perceive is going to be the greatest gain to someone who is going to have an orthosis with each of these parameters?
Well, the gain is if you have seen someone walking with a typical leg, they're not very functional. There's a trade-off in building lower limb prosthesis between stability and functionality. So one of the problems you have is if you build it in such a way as they remain stable so they don't collapse, they can only walk slowly with high energy. On the other hand, if you build it so that they can essentially perform dynamic things, the problem then is that it becomes stiff. My feeling, at least our hypothesis, is that we build the orthosis so that it behaves in a manner similar to the way our normal hand is behaving. That this will essentially what it's going to do is going to adapt to the particular conditions. So that if you're standing quietly in the mid-range, it will have one set of behavior. And you try to make large dynamic movements and another behavior, which will essentially allow us to make more rapid movements.
So extending the question a little bit, the orthosis that you're envisaging, is that to actually provide stimulus or to provide stability only? Like, what I'm asking is, if you're involving some sort of electrical stimulation or magnetic stimulation in the process, these parameters are actually feeding into the electrical stimulation?
Well, there's two answers to that question. You often think that you're building an orthosis in order to apply, to generate force. In fact, what you may in fact be using an orthosis to is using it to counteract inappropriately generated force. So there's a feeling that one of the problems you have in treating spastic people is there's the idea that spasticity may not necessarily be all bad, in that it may in fact interfere with walking, but it may help you to stand up. And so the argument here is if we can build something which has the right control system to either add or subtract torque at the right time, then we can help compensate for this. And I think in the functional electrical stimulation world, where you're actually relying on the human joint to do that, there, my reading of that domain is that most of the emphasis has been on building stimulators and building electrodes, and no one has really thought very hard about how am I actually going to control it. So in fact, the sort of state of the art is you push a button and you want a step, and there's essentially a pre-programmed step that takes place. And one of the problems is stability. So there is a guy at Case Western who has the world's record for the 1K run for paraplegics. It's about 24 minutes, I believe. But his problem is he can't stand up by himself. Right? So he basically has a walker which he can push, and that works fine. And I think part of the reason is that there's no active control. There's no control. It's all remote. And hopefully, the work that we're doing from that viewpoint is going to tell us what is the mechanical behavior, and then we can start answering questions about what behavior it does. If we look at the motor control literature, there is two theories about what the mechanical properties of the joint do. Right? Theory A says is that they do everything, right? That the way we make movements is we essentially change the spring constants and everything follows. This is Anatole Feldman's endpoint control. Another theory says it's all central, right? The brain knows everything, and it just learns to generate the right level of contraction. The Kearney hypothesis is that probably it's a combination of both. Is that the brain learns to not only send the right command, but the periphery is set up in such a way as to behave. So I fully expect to see that the periphery is going to be set up differently if you're trying to, for example, in the Olympics, if you're trying to shoot with accuracy, you're going to set your motor control system up in one way, where you want to optimize stability and accuracy. And on the other hand, when you're interested in minimizing energy expenditure, you set it up another way. And these are questions about how to do it. So from the basic question, we don't really know how the nervous system does it. These methods will, first of all, allow us to answer those questions. And secondly, based on that, hopefully give us the information we need to build sensible bionic devices.